folks. We are going to get started. Welcome everyone to the Board Leadership Alberta Lunch and Learn online learning sessions. This is the final of the set of 3 Lunch and Learn sessions this fall. And we have over 360 people registered for the session today in governing and changing times. So good to have so many of you share your lunch hour with us. All of you are people who make things happen in your community. So good to have you with us. And all of you are part of providing opportunities that make our communities wonderful places to live in. My name is Scott Vaughn. I'm the host for today's Lunch and Learn session on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta. Working behind the scenes with me is our doing tech support is Shanna Shattuzi, and she is also with Board Leadership Alberta. Who is Board Leadership Alberta? Well, Board Leadership Alberta is a collaboration of representatives from Board Leadership Lethbridge, Board Leadership Southeast Alberta, and Board Leadership Edmonton. Many of you may have attended an in-person board leadership training event in the past in Medicine Hat and Lethbridge and Edmonton. They've certainly proven to be very popular and well attended over the past number of years by many not-for-profit board members and staff in Alberta. Board Leadership Alberta consists of representatives from each of these committees with a shared purpose to provide relevant and accessible training for representatives of not-for-profit volunteer sector organizations across all of Alberta. This board leadership initiative is an extension of the training of each of these committees, working together now collaboratively on this specific project, this set of 3 Lunch and Learn sessions. On this slide, you see a listing of all the organizations that have representatives on each of the board leaderships I've identified before, as well as they support this Board Leadership Alberta initiative, these Lunch and Learn sessions. We thank each of these organizations for your support of Board Leadership Alberta, the individual board leadership training events in Edmonton, Medicine Hat, and Lethbridge that you host, as well as your support for not-for-profit groups and organizations in your community. Right now, we'd like to take a moment to recognize that we are on the traditional and ancestral homeland of many diverse people of Alberta, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose ancestors have walked and stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize our role as settlers on this land, and we're grateful to work, live, and learn on this traditional territory. We are located all across Alberta and acknowledge the land of many peoples presently associated with Treaties 6, 7, and 8. And this includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude. I'd also like to now note the chat box feature that you have in your Zoom. Make sure it is open. You may have to hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen for it to pop up. So this can be a place where you can put in your comments, your observations, and questions. I know the chat box has been pretty lively over our previous Lunch and Learns. That's great, because I think we learn from each other as well as from the presenters of the session so far. That's been a really good happening with the Lunch and Learns. But please keep in mind, though, that this is a public chat box intended for attaining your feedback, presenting information, providing links to information, and sharing learnings related to the topic today. So please provide your thoughts and your comments with that consideration. Here's the set of 3 one-hour Lunch and Learn sessions that Board Leadership is proud to have presented this fall. As you can see, we're here for the final one, the 3rd of the series, Governing in Changing Times. And please note that all the Lunch and Learn sessions are recorded and are available on the Board Leadership Alberta YouTube channel. You might have seen that in the resources that was in the chat box. All registrants will receive a link to the video, for this video too, after the session when it's ready. So I'm now very excited on behalf of our Board Leadership Alberta Committee to introduce the speaker for our 3rd and final Lunch and Learn session, Governing in Changing Times, Mike Grogan. Mike Grogan is the president and CEO of IntegralOrg, an Alberta not-for-profit organization that offers education, resources, and support in foundational areas of governance, legal compliance, financial management, strategic planning, change management, and risk management. Over his career, Mike has inspired not-for-profit organizations to tackle complex challenges and for designing solutions to meet their needs. I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Mike Grogan of IntegralOrg, Governing in Changing Times. Over to you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Scott, and I echo your thanks for folks joining us today. I think that to take your time, when time is a precious commodity, to come in to listen, to learn, to share, I'm certainly honored by that. So I'm looking forward to this next, hour or so. We'll do about maybe 40 minutes of presentation, and then some time for questions at the end. We'll put them in the chat box, and Scott will take a look. And I do feel free to invite your participation and your questions as we go. If my past presentations are any guidelines, I'll probably be about halfway through my slides by about that time, and then I'll have to whip through the last 20 in about 30 seconds or so. But we're gonna, when we started talking about this presentation, I think in the spring when Karen reached out and said, could you talk about, what does it mean to govern in changing times? And you think, well, yeah, but by the fall, times will have changed. There's nothing more to change. So apparently I was wrong. So I had to make a presentation. So, but luckily we're talking about two of, I think, my favorite things. And I do really like to talk about governance. I do like to talk about how we run organizations and how this sort of very, I think, unique and curious structure as a board. And I'll use that quote to frame our work. But I also like to talk about change and what's happening out there. And as part of the work that we do in IntegralOrg is we like to help organizations understand what's happening in our environment. So we'll use some of that framework for today. We'll talk about both these constructs. I'll start a bit with the change side and then get back at the end, try to leave you with at least some frameworks, some thoughts on governance as to how that might, how you may navigate this landscape. And navigation is certainly a challenging thing. Here we go, I hope. I want to start with this quote, and we'll come back to this. I will come back to this at the end. And this is a piece from Stanford Social Innovation, came out this spring. Probably one of the better pieces on governance that I have heard in the last few years. Boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. So I want you to hold that in mind too, and just recognize that as we navigate change, that the mechanism that we're sort of working with are boards. And there's nothing quite like a board. I was trying to think, okay, what's out there in the world that looks like a board? And there's not many things. It's a bunch of folks that you may or may not know. You're passionate about a cause. You've got some rules that guide you, but there's a lot of sort of leeway as to how you do that work. You sit both atop and outside the organizational structure with a role that is accountable to those outside the organization as well as within. So I think there's a lot of nuance to how we do this work. How do we manage change? But part of that sitting atop the structure is to be aware of what's happening outside of our organizations, to step back from the day-to-day. And whether you're a board that has staff, a board that does all the work yourself, there's still a part of board work that calls upon us to say, what's happening in the environment? What's happening out in the world of nonprofits, in the economic world, the political world, the social world? These days, health and safety is such a big thing. And then how do we govern? How do we work with that? And so that's my structure today. I'm going to walk through some of those trends. Just as a bit of a caveat, I am an economist. Economics is called the dismal science for a reason. I'll try not to delve too deeply into that stuff. But I'm also an optimist. So I think there's lots of both. We've got to be aware of what's happening out there, and some of the trends are trickier. But there's lots of opportunity here. So we'll walk through those. But as you think through this, think about what's your role as a board? What do I need to learn from this? Not every trend will be that apparent that are relevant to your organization, but hopefully there's something in here you can take and say, yeah, I see something we need to work up with. At the end, I'll give you 2 or 3 frameworks as a board to walk through with that. So the question, I think a lot of times is what's the nonprofit world like? And this is kind of my metaphor for the nonprofit sector these days. So this is the Blue Man Group. This is a bunch of guys who are bald and paint themselves blue and do performance art. And if you've ever seen them, I think you know a few things. One is it's quite different, but it's a very almost participatory thing. So if you're in the front row in this picture, these guys are drumming, there's paint, they've got lights. In the front row, you're wearing a poncho because it gets pretty messy. In the middle, you get kind of this great view of the stage, and you can sort of see what's going on. You can kind of enjoy the show. In the back, it's probably pretty hard to figure what's going on. This is my metaphor for the sector these days. For some, it's going to be pretty messy, and you have to take some measures to protect yourself, maybe mitigate that mess. For most, you're probably okay. May not be enjoyable, but you're going to be okay. You're going to come through this. And for some, it's just really hard to tell where we're going. And so as we work through this, we'll work through some of the trends as to why that is. And here's some of the trends we're thinking about right now. So all my sources, I'll try and cite these as we go through and tell you where they're from. If you want to find more information, you'll have a copy of the PowerPoint. Certainly, if anything is unclear, reach out, throw it in the chat box. We will make sure that you get a sense of where this comes from. But many organizations have weathered the pandemic reasonably well thus far. We're not done by any means. And to say we're in wave 4 of how many, I don't think anybody knows. But it may not feel like we've done that well. So I think there's still lots of stresses out there, the funding side of things, the social side of things, but it's also been uneven across the sector. There are some subsectors, some organizations that have done better, some worse. I don't think anybody's super thriving, but there's some groups that have really been challenged through this. If you're arts or faith groups that relied on people having in a performance or in a facility, those were hit earlier on. There's some parts where your funding model is a donation side. Those have been hit really hard too. So recovery is very uneven across the sector. It's been an uneven pandemic, and it'll continue to be an uneven pandemic in recovery. In general, charities across Canada have experienced very significant impacts financially from this pandemic. Broad-based declines in revenue sources, certainly earned income, donations, and sponsorships across the board. But we are starting to see some signs of recovery. This summer, over the summer, some data out of Stats Canada, the business conditions data has sort of said that incomes are perhaps starting to come up. Maybe the decrease is starting to be a little bit less, and people are optimistic. People are optimistic what the next year will bring. Again, that's a bit of an asterisk beside it because what was true a month or two ago may not be true today. That's how fast things are changing. But also some of the things that are tougher that we haven't perhaps dealt with at scale before in the sector are staff well-being and mental health. This is some data we got later last fall. I think it came out again in the spring. And it's a challenging area for us, partly because it's challenging, certainly the environment we're working in, but it's an area that at this level, we're probably not used to dealing with as a sector. I think we're very used to dealing with funding declines. We're very used to dealing with shortfalls and finding ways to navigate insufficient funding. We're not necessarily used to dealing with staff mental health at this scale. And probably the mechanisms we've learned about funding, doing more with less, sort of pulling yourself up your bootstraps, just grinding it out. Those worked well for funding, probably the exact opposite of the mechanisms we need for this kind of endeavor. And as we move forward, this will be something we'll need to think about. If you're a board team, think of how is your staff doing? If you're working with volunteers, will they be there? Will they be engaged? How do you make sure that they're being taken care of? Because there's lots of pieces to this pandemic that go well beyond the nonprofit world we're in. One of the things that you see is that we're seeing there's this mismatch between the supply, the capacity for services, the demand for services, and our capacity to engage services. So you see this quite often in nonprofits. Red being our organizational capacity, blue being the demand for our services. And in some places we're okay, some places not. Even organizations where the demand for services is down, that could largely be organizations who are still hibernated or working in a very reduced model. But kind of in the middle there, you're seeing lots of organizations saying it's getting busier and I don't have the capacity to do the work. One of the reasons we're having a tough time navigating this is just no roadmap. This is a pretty standard disaster recovery type of map. You have the impact of the event. We rally around sort of responding to that event. In this case, we went home, we adapted programs, we did okay. There's a bit of energy that came with that, if not excitement. And as we ground it out over the next year or two, or a year and a half so far, you sort of lose some of that interest and you start to think, do you come up? This is far more weighty than probably most situations or crises that we've gone through. And that will wear down over time. The idea of how we keep that energy up and how we that focus, how we back off of that when it's time, we've got sort of unlimited demand for our service, but limited capacity. That's going to be a challenge for us moving forward. I'm going to give you 4 brief vignettes on some of the trends that are out there. I'm going to give you some stuff in economics. The real world begins in economics. Walter Brueggemann, get to put a little Old Testament theology in there just to start us off. This is some data again from Imagine Canada. They've done some great work. This is one thing that's kind of the odd part of a pandemic. We've had some great data out there. In Imagine Canada, the Alberta Nonprofit Network, some groups have really done very well in making sure we have a touch point at least on some parts of the sector. This isn't the whole sector. This is a survey, so take it with a bit of grain of salt that way. But you see that different organizations have been impacted in different ways. The very bottom part of the graph, the red part is the decreases in revenues, the blue is increases. Overall, probably more decreases than increases in revenue in the sector. But look above that in the line for arts, culture, and recreation, 73% or 71%, sorry, of organizations seeing decreases. Again, this is a subsector that's been hit very hard. Probably challenged before, certainly in arts before, with sponsorships being hit with the economic side of things, but then not being able to have people and facilities hit them very, very strongly. Moving up, though, you see places like social services being okay, not necessarily super strong, but far less impacted. And that really comes down to what the funding models were for organizations. If you're a government-funded group, at the end of the bottom here, you've done okay. Not everyone's doing well, but far stronger than perhaps if you're relying on earned revenues or gifts and donations. So far, that has been one of the areas that has mitigated at least some of the financial impacts. One of the interesting things that came with the data this summer was that, for years we've sort of preached that mixed funding models are a source of stability, or they help organizations moving forward when times get tough. The data from this data set at least challenges that notion, that the mixed model, when you have one pot that goes down, you sort of can leverage the strengths of the other ones. The problem on this side, this pandemic was, or this economic situation was, that they all got hit. So organizations that had that blended funding model were perhaps amongst the hardest hit right now. Whereas organizations who had a government, usually sole source or largely sourced government funding sort of model, were a little more stable for now. And it's not that everybody had a government funding model did well. And some of that government funding was spread across the sector in things like wage subsidies. Other times it was targeted towards organizations working in vulnerable populations, frontline services. So again, a very uneven recovery and engagement of the pandemic. Some of the trends we're looking at, and we don't talk about GDP a lot. I mean, who does, except for economists and academics perhaps, but GDP is really just how well we're doing. It's a measure of our standard of how things are going, and a pretty simplified way of viewing that. But we will get back to where we were. In a couple of years from now, the goal is, or the thinking is, we'll be back to kind of where we were before the pandemic. Now, we dug a pretty big hole. We weren't necessarily doing super well, but there is hope. We are slowly recovering. There are signs of recovery. The nonprofit sector tends to lag the overall economy by, I used to say 6 months to a year. I don't know how long this time, but when we'd have the previous sort of downturns, you would see the nonprofit sector follow 6 months later. And as we came out, follow back up 6 months later. I expect that will happen as things turn around. So we watch the overall economy and say, okay, now we'll start to feel like we're getting better. Labor markets will remain high for a couple more years, and we'll still have some high unemployment. That does affect things like donations, tax bases. It affects client services. Are there more people out there for our client bases? Government funding has been the primary driver of change or stability through the sector, through wage subsidies, through different programs that way. I'll give you some of my speculation of how long or whether that continues. We are seeing that back off now. So we're having a sort of odd situation where many organizations are perhaps having one of their better financial years in a long time. Take the wage subsidy out, we're not quite sure if that's the case or not. And individual and corporate donations have declined significantly and have been going down for quite a while, certainly on the individual side for years. So those aren't expected to come back. So two graphs really drive this home. Again, I'm an economist, you get a lot of graphs. Are two that cause me to think, and you can certainly draw your own conclusions or think, okay, what does this mean for us? Anytime I give you data, it's what does this mean for us? It's not trying to present a truth, it's saying I need to help think through some of this stuff. So these two are the ones that cause me to think of it. And one is, these are Alberta budget balances. These are over about 40 years, anything above the lines when we had a surplus in this province, and below the lines we're running a deficit. And so even some of the things we're talking about now about budget deficits are not new. For the last 15 years or so in Alberta, we have probably not figured out a sustainable funding model. Regardless of political party or political stripe, we just haven't cracked this nut yet. And so even before COVID, I think this is a situation. And for me, it thinks, okay, how long can those programs and the organizations that had a strong government funding mandate, how long does that continue? Not saying there's going to be cuts, but there's going to be something that's going to come into balance here as we move forward. And the second trend is on donations. And donations is a longer term trend for us. So the top bar on this one is Canada-wide, about just about 10 billion in donations a year for individuals. The bottom in Alberta, about 1.5 billion. So we punch a little bit above our weight per capita in terms of what we give. But the real question here is this remained flat. It's been flat for donations for a long time. If you extend this line back, it's actually decreasing. So less people are giving money through donations. A longer term trend, lots of reasons for that, I think. And we're seeing it across all age groups. So in the blue, it's 2006. In the red is 2016, some Stats Can data. That's the last full data sets we have to work with. And you see across every age group, less people are giving. That is still true that as you get older, more people give, but less people giving. And it's creating this idea of almost a crisis in the sector. So Canada Helps, probably arguably the largest online fundraiser in the country these days. In short, we've been saying the same thing at Canada Helps for 3 years. The giving patterns we're seeing are leading towards a crisis in the sector. As the demand for charity services increase, donations just aren't following. And whether or not you're an organization that does a lot of fundraising, it's important to watch this trend. Fundraising can be certainly the financial side of things. It can be a measure of trust in the sector. A lot of times when organizations have their funding reduced in some places, you got an away contract or government contract, your initial response is, well, we'll go fundraising. Fair enough, it's certainly a valid path forward, but if everybody takes that model and the pot's getting smaller, it's hard to see that working for all of us. So be aware of these conditions if you're moving to this place. Those folks in this space are certainly well aware of this dynamic. There are some bright sides, though, on fundraising. I mean, certainly online donations have continued to increase. You're seeing, I think, embracement of this, even when funding patterns were down. People are giving more online, sort of democratizing some of this work. Able to get your message out to broader populations, broader people beyond your own networks. Younger demographics are very active in online fundraising, and I think changing some of the things that are being funded. One of the other dynamics in fundraising is that those 1.5 billion in Alberta are not equally distributed. About 80% of that money goes to about 10% of organizations, usually very large players. So online stuff tends to spread that out a bit more into causes that we probably haven't seen being funded this way. And that's probably not a bad thing. So it's going to sort of spread some of that wealth out beyond some of those traditional causes. Some of the things we're thinking about as we move forward in economics, the question I always have is how do we pay for things? What's the challenge of debt? How and when we're going to pay for things we need out there? Is this taxation? Is this cutbacks? Is this growth? I'll give you some thoughts. We get to political stuff on that. And then the idea of value-based granting. What happens in this sector as we move forward with grantors making decisions based on different value sets? You're seeing that in the States, the Ford Foundation saying they're only going to fund matters of equity and diversity, moving out of all other granting things. We're seeing it in some funders in Alberta as they move towards at least shorter term grants based entirely around diversity or equity, which is an area that's probably been underfunded in many ways, has been underfunded, but it also means that other things don't get funded. So how big will that shift be when you start moving towards some of these areas? And the power of individuals, the way that people give, going back to that online giving type of thing, when programs like Benevity challenge models like the United Way, what does that do for overall funding? Does that increase it? Does it decrease it? Does it spread it fuller? So those are the questions that we follow. The ways that money is being given out and the place it's been giving is really changing. So again, as you think through your economic model, think through the economic side, the government side, the donation side, the earned revenue side. Earned revenue will probably follow the overall economy more closely than the other two, at least right away. Politics, what's happening on the political side? I'll keep this kind of short and try not to make it too controversial. It's mostly just kind of stuff you probably already know. Pre-COVID, the UCP followed really closely to their platform, remarkably closely. I mean, I think the idea that they had a very detailed platform and they followed it sometimes word for word and moved quite quickly. And the one thing that was, whether you agreed with that or not, doesn't matter. What it gave the sector was a target to engage. You knew what the UCP was about. You knew where they stood on things. You knew if you had to make a case for something, you kind of knew what their position was. COVID has thrown that into a bit of a, if not delayed, a bit more of a whirlwind, perhaps. That the mental health side of things, the economic side of things, really the health measures, the polarization that's coming out of this, has made it really hard for organizations to figure out where do we fit, how do we engage, how do we get our cause out there and find traction within a system that's so much reactive right now. I don't know if there's any other way around that. That's probably the state of many governments these days, if not most. But there will come a time that will slow down a bit. And hopefully we'll back off this. There'll be something that'll look like normality. We can start to say not just where the government wants to go, but how do we engage that with the causes that we're all about. Lots of division, certainly not pretty again self-evident within just the province and UCP of how to gauge, how to work with this. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. The balanced budget goal is there. I think this is a government that ran on balancing the budget. I don't think that's going to go away. So as we think back through some of the mechanisms they have to do that, I'll give you a bit of stuff on that in a minute here. That's not going away. It's delayed. It's going to come back. The overall framework is that we're going to do that through growth. We're not going to raise taxation. We're going to grow our way to this, and then we can sort of see if that will work or not. This is the chart I showed you before. about budget balances, fiscal balances in Alberta, and some of the highlights that we've sort of seen over the years and how governments have engaged this. So you'll sort of look to the scissors there in the sort of mid-90s. This is the Ralph Klein cuts. Some people say, can we cut our way out of this? Over the course of 2 budget cycles, the Klein government cut about 15 to 16% of the overall Alberta budget. More so for social services, about 21%, I think they cut. And it did manage to balance the budget. Now, they did get the wave of this probably largest boom in resource revenues in Alberta's history just after it. Probably really was the bigger factor than that. But there is a model out there that say you can cut and get yourself back into some semblance of balance. We had so much money by the mid sort of 2000, we had Ralph bucks. We had money just flowing. So people got $400 and invested it wisely. I am sure that it's probably paying off for you really well in the long-term investments. And then it just collapsed again. And then it comes down to the sense that it wasn't going to last. And this is the absolute roller coaster of the Alberta economy. When resource revenues collapse, we all know the government budget follows. 2014, Jim Prentice says we need to take a look in the mirror because we're hitting a structural change now. We need to figure out something to do. And then we move into this longer period of substantive deficits, and COVID comes along. So you have this sort of pattern. We've seen these things before, and governments are left with a few different ways of engaging. And I think these all affect nonprofits and the change we're going to have to navigate in both the short and longer term. You can cut expenditures. You can say we're going to just either across the board in certain areas, make some choices. We'll cut. We can ride the resource roller coaster again, and we're doing that these days. Right now, we have both oil and gas at least 10-year highs. And so things will look a little softer. The things that are driving those increases are probably not structural or systemic. They are shorter term supply things, so they won't necessarily last. So hopefully we don't get too enamored by that. We can increase or redistribute taxes. We're seeing probably a bit of that right now. Things like user fees, thinking even the idea of equalization perhaps is a redistribution of taxes. Or we can change how services are delivered. And I think arguably the government is probably looking at all variations of these things as we look forward right now. The idea of civil society. Civil society is a UCP construct in their platform. It's certainly from the UK. You've seen in different places that communities solve problems. You don't necessarily need government to solve a problem. You need communities to solve problems. Nonprofit sectors are a natural link in those two worlds, I think. So perhaps some opportunities there. How prevalent that gets, how powerful that model can go. We've got lots of work to do on that. But all these are levers I think that governments can work with as they move forward in this tougher economic times. So questions we think about in terms of politics, again, the balance. How do we balance all the pressing needs that are out there? How do we balance sustainability financially with environmental and social needs, cultural needs that are out there that require funding? And the idea of how powerful will civil society be? If we went down this idea of civil society and communities solve problems, we backed off some of the institutional models. I'm a pretty big nonprofit fan, and I think, but there's an institutional side to nonprofits too. And what if some of those responses were decentralized and put out into community? What would that do for us as organizations? Maybe we wouldn't need as many organizations as people are helping neighbors. Neighbors are helping neighbors. What does that do for boards? With organizations and the things we do, the purpose of our work is more important than the actual organizational structures. On the social side, this is probably my favorite quote. I think the idea that we change things socially by talking. And at the end, I'll show you a toolkit that we're putting out there to help you have conversations. But there's a lot of social trends and social dynamics that have emerged, some before COVID, some during COVID, some have been emphasized by COVID. The pandemic has fueled many social crises. So the opioid stuff, mental health, addiction, socializations, it's probably, I think, magnified the cracks that were there. These aren't necessarily caused by the pandemic necessarily. These are cracks that were there. And just like in organizations, things that were weak before, I think are going to get magnified through this crisis, these crises. In society, same sort of things. The impacts of COVID and early COVID have been uneven and have disproportionately impacted women, immigrants, those with lower income or educational levels. This is some data we started to see probably 6 months out of the start of COVID that's saying this is not a pandemic or a crisis, it's evenly spread. And so for organizations working with these populations, you're certainly well aware of that. For others, probably start thinking that there are resources starting to flow to even things out a bit. So then again, choices to be made as to where resources and attention is getting paid for some of this work. Obviously, a renewed focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. Last week, with Truth and Reconciliation, Orange Shirt Day, certainly in the sector at least, a major event, very prevalent. Other parts community, perhaps not so much. Lots of work to do there beyond the nonprofit world. Lots of divisions in this province, again, between approaches to health and safety, how we manage this stuff, what works in different communities, what works for different populations. But other longer term trends too, and we've become very reactionary as we deal with different crises. Recognize there's things that are happening out there in other parts, and this is just one, that we're soon going to have the smallest working age cohort supporting the largest seniors cohort. Less people working, more seniors in population. That's a huge shift in this country. In Alberta, younger population won't be quite the same as other provinces for a few years, maybe a decade or so, but it is coming for all of us. It's going to affect taxation. It's going to affect who earns money, who gets taxed. It's going to affect service delivery. A lot more focuses, resources and programming focus on seniors, perhaps less on children. So there's shifts coming that we need to start thinking through. And one of the frames I'll give you is start thinking, well, what do you think out 10 years, 20 years? What does this look like for your organization? We spend a lot of our time thinking day to day, well, what do things look like in the next decade or so for organizations? So I'll give you some thoughts on how we can do that. As we think about getting back to normal and socially, some things we need to sort of consider, the big letdown. Will it be a wave of turnover in this sector? And this is something that for the nonprofit world, I think we rallied really well. I think people have responded really well in terms of different working environments, to taking care of their clients, to keeping managing things. For boards, I think it's been hard. And board to govern, again, is hard at the best of times. To do it through remote things is hard. But we see a bit of a letdown here. Will people back off of either employment in the nonprofit sector, or volunteerism, of engagement in general? Will we say, we're in it together, I just need to take care of myself? That's not necessarily a bad thing. But will we see this sort of letdown, and what will we do with that if we don't have the bodies? We're starting to see that now on the employment side in some subsectors, certainly disabilities. I know some folks here from there today from that sector saying it's just hard to get people. It's hard to have people come and work when you can make more at Tim Hortons. So we're back to some of those trends we perhaps saw in 2007, 2006, where getting folks to work in organizations is certainly challenging. And then what changes to our governance and management styles are going to come as we go down the path of decolonization and anti-racism. Much of our work and much of the traditional even roles of the structure of boards and governance is a colonial model, perhaps. So what changes in that? How do we bring in different viewpoints and different thoughts, and how to integrate those and to learn from those things? So those are some of the things we're thinking about as we think about moving forward on the social side of things. Health and safety. And this is something that is certainly top of mind, obviously, for everybody, and it's got all kinds of nuance to it. The COVID environment has dominated this, the safety side. As we sort of move back into sort of working together, of having businesses open, health and safety the last few months are top of mind for most folks. Just in general, as a nonprofit employer, and even if you work with volunteers are considered workers under occupational health and safety, that you have an obligation to take every reasonable precaution to protect the health and safety of your workers. So even with all the changes that have come in the last month or two about opening up, occupational health and safety hasn't changed, employment standards have not changed, human rights legislation has not changed. And one of the challenges is that we've been sort of left to ourselves to figure out how to navigate these things. But the basics are still in place. So you still have the obligation to create a safe workplace for your employees. You still make sure that you're taking their rights and their safety into mind, along with the safety of your clients. There's lots of talk about mandatory vaccination policies to protect workers. There's a lot of nuance to that out there. So as you move forward, I would encourage you to do your own due diligence. Each situation will be, it's each organization's job. And this is a great role for boards to make sure that you are saying, for our own situation, for the type of work we do, the ways we do our work, the populations we engage, what is our policy on this? There's always a room for collaboration and sharing this sector, but the work you need to do has to be your work. So you may be informed by other people's work, but my encouragement would be that you take the time to engage resources. We've got a toolkit up on our site. Again, it's one resource. If you need to talk to folks, there's HR and legal folks out there, but the risks in this one are high. So as we move forward into risky areas, it's probably best to engage quite deeply and quite intentionally in this area. There's some great interesting data. So that's the legal side of sort of health and safety, but there's also this social side of health and safety too, about what people are thinking about coming back. And there's been a fantastic data set that's run by what's called sort of the experience economy, recreation, arts. It's been multiple repetitive surveys over the entire pandemic. And it's what people's comfort level is like coming back. And whether you're running a performance or not, or doing workshops or anything you do that's sort of an in-person thing, there's lessons for us in this one. And that, over the summer, we're seeing certainly that optimism that people would be more ready to come back to being in person. I would say there's an asterisk beside this one. I think it's probably diminished a bit into the fall here. I hope they do another data run of this kind of stuff. But people are thinking they're coming back. But it's not even. There are people who are risk reducers, people who are risk takers, people who are risk avoiders. So not everybody is the same. When we're doing our planning, we're doing, I think, what will we do? It's probably good that we think about what are different perceptions about risk, because it's not a one size fits all. In general, people want the safety measures to be really clear. They want to know what's going on. They want to say, what are you doing for me so I can make a decision whether to come back or not? But it's going to shift over time. There are things that may stick around. So let's focus on health and safety, on protocols, on distancing, probably may stay for a while at least. But longer than that, the idea that we need to be transparent about how we're protecting people. Those things may be more permanent, flexibility, refunds, what happens if there's COVID outbreaks, but health and safety measures that we need to think about in other places as well. So again, it's not one size fits all, and not that anything's right or wrong, but as you think about this, especially organizations are working in different parts of the province and different ways of working, recognize there's some folks who are very comfortable in high comfort in large groups. That's sort of the left side of the screen. Mediums, the medium comfort levels. They'll think it's sort of limited to their own social groups, and some who just don't want any. This has changed a bit. We saw some growth in the summer that there'd be more people in high, but still most people are a little bit hesitant on this. So as you're planning workshops, as you're planning conferences, you're thinking, when does this shift? And you probably want some indication that public attitudes are shifting before we start doing real big plans to gather folks around. It does matter where you are. And if you're working across the province, knowing that what might feel okay in Calgary is not going to feel the same in rural organizations. So in Calgary, probably a little more risk neutrality. I think there's folks that are probably somewhat comfortable and some lower levels of discomfort. In some rural communities, far more willingness to gather in larger groups. Again, this will shift over time, but again, not a one size fits all solution either. So the questions we're thinking about: what are your policies in terms of workers and clients, keeping them safe from COVID? What are you doing out there that is making sure you've got them in place? They're your policies, that they're front and center, they're clear, they're accessible, that your workers and your clients know what's going on. What do you need to put? What policies, if any, do you need to put in place around vaccination? So the if any is important. Not everybody needs a vaccination policy, but make sure for your situation, what might that be? And have you thought it through, both the risks of that and what you're going to do to make sure it's clear and well articulated? But also things like privacy and privacy law considerations about vaccination, about status, about different health issues. As we're starting to take in more information, or even asking staff if you're vaccinated, there's private health information there. So make sure your privacy policies are up to date too, to make sure that you're putting in those kind of things. Back to governance now. So what do we do with all this? There's lots there. I can talk trends forever. But the idea of, what do you do? What are some of the frameworks as boards we can perhaps use? I'll give you probably three or four different ones you can sort of think about. Some of it's pretty well known, I think. Some of it's perhaps new. But going back to this, the Stanford Social Innovation Review article, I'll pull a bit of stuff from that. But think about this. How do you be this board? How do you do this? How do you work with this unique and curious leadership structure that has this responsibility to both be atop and within the organization at the same time? So a few frameworks. This is a fairly one that's been around for about 15 years. Governance is leadership. And it gives the work of boards in three functional areas. Fiduciary, and recognize these are all interrelated. You don't just say pick one to be a sort of, I think, a healthy board, a board that challenges yourself. You probably need to lean into all these things in different ways at different times and different levels. So fiduciary is kind of taking care of the assets of organization. This is risk management. This is making sure your financial statements, your policies. I would say this is kind of the here and now, making sure you're taking care of what you have going right now is well done, is making sure you're legally compliant, that you've got, you're following policy. It is a place where boards spend a lot of time. I think we're very good at fiduciary duty, not always, but I think in general, this is a place that's really known to us. And so in times of crisis, this is a time we do need to lean on that. There's lots of things in policy we need to make sure we've got in place. There's lots of financial questions out there. So think about not just for today and the next few months, but looking down the road a little bit, what can we expect for this organization? So that fiduciary lens is certainly really important. Continue to work with that, lean on it. There's also the strategic lens. And strategic part of governance or leadership is that we're looking down the road a bit more. What are those midterm strategies? Where are we going to go the next 3 to maybe 5? As we do strategic planning, one of the One of the sort of rules of thumb is as uncertainty grows, the sort of planning horizon shrinks. You know, we maybe used to do 5-year plans. I'm probably more thinking 3 a lot of times. And right now I'm probably doing 3 to 6 month plans for a lot of organizations because it's just so unclear. And we might put some that are kind of aspirational, but you need to flex a bit more. But thinking through for your organization, do you have a succession coming? Do you have some program growth coming? Do you have what might be? But what are those longer term strategic pieces? They're still important, maybe a little harder to do these days, but that's a role for boards certainly to lean into that role. And the generative governance, you know, what is it? What's that sort of really longer term? What is going to happen 5 years, 10 years down the road? This is a bit speculative sometimes, but it's still really important that we don't just narrow down to the today's work and thinking that the world's going to look just like it does today. We need to sort of think, you know, what's coming down the road? What are we really going to be about in 10 years? When things like anti-racism and equity really take off, what does that mean? Where's our place in that? When we see economic trends or demographic trends changing, you know, where are we really going to go with that stuff? What does that mean for organization? It doesn't mean you need to plan your way through it, but it's starting to think about these things because that will impact your work back through your strategy and your fiduciary duties. So governance is leadership. It's a book came out 15 years ago. Chait, Ryan, and Taylor. It's a good resource. There are some things on the internet about it. But those 3 lenses, I mean, think about that: fiduciary, strategic, and how do we put those types of conversations in? Or how do we take an issue that may arise for a board and think about what's the strategic implication, what's the fiduciary implication, what's the generative one? So it may not be 3 discrete conversations. It may well be something that is, you know, something arises on an issue and you can sort of put these lenses to it and ask yourself questions about what it might look like. Purpose-driven leadership, and this is the way I pulled the quote from, again, from Stanford Social Innovation, really good piece, publicly available, just 4 principles of purpose-driven leadership. And it challenges to sort of think beyond organizations and the idea of prioritizing your purpose versus the organization. This is a tough one. I'm on a board. I mean, I work for a board, I'm on a board, I teach board stuff, but it's hard to put the purpose first, because we're used to protecting the organization, building up our funding model, building up our programming model, building up our place in the marketing, and to say, you know, but we're really about the purpose. I'm not about building organization. I'm about what the end is. And it's both and, so you need sort of one without the other, but at some point organizations become temporary constructs. And so how do we keep that purpose first? And a lot of the work of boards is sort of protecting here and now. It challenges us to think about what's a better way for this to be done. If we're about the purpose, is it to, you know, merge them in the organization? Is it about to let our programs be taken over by somebody else? Is it about some new way of doing things that doesn't involve us, as long as the purpose is yet completed? Things like respect for the ecosystem, recognizing that what we do isn't benign. We're not just doing good things, that we impact the ecosystem we work within. In positive or negative ways. I think largely positive, but there's things we can do out there that, because of our very work, may affect the ecosystem. This is true for, you know, from funders. It's from the way people fund. They give money to do good things. But sometimes, you know, perhaps the way you give funding or get your money, maybe in that sense. So it challenges us to think in that systemic kind of way. And the equity mindset, you know, again, how do we sort of advance some of those equitable measures, equitable outcomes, and look at the ways that our organization, and big or small, we have contributed to some of the places we're in. And so how do we take that seriously and to really delve, you know, deep into some of those things around equity that I think we're seeing so prevalent these days. Another lens, this one's called the Big Reset. This is an organization called Leap of Reason. They're one of my favorite sort of tools to draw from these days. And they would frame it this way, that the future of the nonprofit sector will be framed by 2 realities. The demand for core services will skyrocket, and the supply of funding for nonprofit services will be limited. Now, you could probably say that's true for any time in the nonprofit sector. They're basically saying, no, as we sort of, these will be really acute, perhaps. So that as you move forward, thinking that this mismatch between supply and demand is going to become to the point where we're critical. So if we were there before and we managed to navigate that, perhaps we're heading to some sort of tipping point. We need to provide some guidance to think about for this. You know, to face the realities. This is not a time to sort of say, oh, we're just going to get through it, or it's back to business as usual. Now, the realities may not be all bad. The realities may be that you're okay, but take a look at those. Take a look at that, what's around you, what's coming. Do not think of what the reality was 2 years ago necessarily comes back. As we sort of talk through strategy, a lot of times we do talk about that recovery does not mean restoration. So we will recover from this, or this sector will recover. Most organizations will get through this, but it may not be restoring back to the previous state. So face those realities, think about what's coming, talk about your purpose, not just your activities. Talk about what you're doing in society, both internally and externally. Certainly, I think there is the idea externally, it's a great thing to do, but internally, say we're about this. The way we operate is important, but our purpose is probably more important. Rallying your people, whether they're board, staff, volunteers, it's a tough time on people. It's tough to keep people engaged. It's tough to keep people who are passionate and have given so much. How do you keep going? And I think that is something that we need to attend to. More of our time needs to be spent on that, taking care of ourselves, taking care of the people that are doing the work, caring for the caregivers. I would say focus in the next 12 to 18 months. We like to think where we're going 3 to 5 years out. The next 12 to 18 months will be really critical. So when you're doing your planning, be really clear. Work out really bluntly realistic cash flow projections. If you're wrong on the upside, fair enough, but at least you know what's coming. And then consider restructuring. And this isn't a bad thing. Restructuring, consolidations, we will see nonprofits go out of business, and we do every year. Sometimes, most times you don't hear about it, but we do lose probably hundreds, if not 1,000 every year in Alberta. But it's not a failure. There's not a failure to wind down a nonprofit. The timing, the situation, the structural pieces don't work. It's time to celebrate the work. It's time to say there was good work for a time, those resources get released, and things happen again. So again, it's purpose before organization. These are challenging conversations to have sometimes. I think it's how to have these conversations. IntegralOrg, just today, we've launched a new toolkit, just fortuitously. I didn't write this for the presentation, but it launched about an hour ago, and Critical Conversations Toolkit. And it's walking through things like governance, health and safety, program sustainability. I think we do risk management in there too, a few different ones. We talk about, here's some conversations to have. Some of them on the fiduciary side, on that sort of what's the here and now, some of them tending towards generative, what's down the road, but to help you as a board or staff team have these conversations. Made them portable so you can print off the PDFs. It's on our website there. And there's a blog we came out to do as well to go with it. For one, it's both the change of seasons and a season of change. So lots of stuff there. I would invite you to put any comments, questions, rebuttals into the chat box, and we can go for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, perhaps, so I can see something. So, Scott, anything to start with?
Well, there's a couple questions. One came around that the thought that employers have to ask clients, members, etc. A real example here, and just see how, maybe trying to look how you might perceive this challenge, a real example to some of the things that you mentioned. But if employers have to ask clients, members, etc. to show mandatory vaccination, however, the company itself does not have the mandate for their employees, doesn't that show it's quite illegal to mandate? Again, how we as not-for-profits navigate this kind of challenge, some of those, the things like it, and maybe that's like those specific things that are coming down the pipe right now.
Yeah, it's unclear. I mean, to recognize that the regulations around running a business, which and being a nonprofit for public facing, client facing, performance facing, are different than employment, and they are, and the clarity around employment law. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you advice on lawyers. So, but it's the idea that the clarity is not there. It's more clear on the client side, perhaps, even though I think it was a bit rough to sort of figure that out too. It's less clear on the employment side. So they're not the same thing, and they're not related necessarily. So to say that one affects the other, yes, they seem incongruent, perhaps they seem in conflict, but they're not the same thing. They deal with different legislation. They deal with different policies. So there's little guidance on the employer side. What you're seeing is larger employers, or those that can mandate it, are going down the mandatory vaccination path. There's still a risk there. And these are organizations that I'm going to probably likely assume, if not tell you, have done their due diligence. They've consulted their legal folks. They understand the risks. They understand that, if I go on this path and mandate it, then I know that if something happens, I'm going to be able to push back or mitigate that risk. Nonprofits don't tend to have that type of legal support. They don't tend to have that type of HR support necessarily, nor do they have the wheels to fight things that should things go sideways. So it is a challenging situation. It is one that has been in the sector for a long time. Or not for a long time, but it's not new. But to make the connection between client side and employment side is really, really hard. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, lots of interest in the toolkit coming up on the chat box there. So I think we're those ways of how to address, how to deal with those specific challenges. I think we're certainly, but you set a really good framework. Another question, again, from the perspective that, strategies from an economical perspective, words of advice to wisdom. I know that you provided some things, that you provided to navigate this environment, but what might be, like, if you had a final words of wisdom, advice, to, as you said, the next 6 to 8 months, to 8 to 10 months, 12 months ahead, what are some key words of advice as you navigate this whole environment that we're in right now as not-for-profits?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends so much on what your business model is. I would say, first of all, understand your business model. I mean, it's not language we tend to use a lot in nonprofits, but really understand to say that I've got a mix of programs, but each one of those programs has both an impact in terms of what it does for my overall mission, but also has a financial model to it. So understand really clearly your financial models. So say, and rough that out, blunt it, make sure you've got it either, it's got to be understood. So know your business model first, because it's hard to say, what can I do moving forward if I don't understand, here's what I really think should happen. If that's a model that relies upon government funding, then, you'd be aware of what's happening. But when is it time to start making your case for your cause to say, okay, for nonprofits, as in general, and we work at a sort of organizational level, not the sector level, but it's the idea that nonprofits are a part of recovery, that we are a part of the economic model. We think we do very well on the social side, that we provide a cause, we provide services to make sure communities are okay. But there's certainly a part to say that the nonprofit sector is an economic force as well. You've got billions in revenue, probably a little over 140, 150,000 employees, perhaps, that there are some places we can play as we move forward. The government will move back to jobs in the economy. The pipelines will quite make it as strongly. It will be jobs in the economy. When that language starts to come back to be more prevalent, and the public health side drops down, make sure we're ready to engage that, whether it's, at best to not be forgotten and to be cut, perhaps. I don't know if there'll be large cuts or not, but to make sure your case is in there. If you've got an earned revenue side, how are you going to make sure people are really comfortable with coming back to your performances or your events, your sports groups, whatever it might be? So it's probably overemphasizing the things that you think are strong, that are lined up with the mood of the day, whether it's in government on jobs, whether it's the public and saying, I'm going to come back to see an arts performance or go to a sports event. I think you need to be aware of what the moods out there and the trends, and then say, okay, here's what I am doing, not just saying, I'm here, I'm doing something good, I'm sure you'll come back. So it's probably things that you already have in place, but emphasizing the positives and the intentionality of how you're engaging the reality of where we're at.
Maybe a question, Shmuel had a question there, kind of ties into that. What is, you see from an economic perspective, some of the work, some of the things you've been doing, the role of government and other authorities in this modern and so quickly changing world, even related to some of our institution, health, education, on creating employment workplaces, how to, we talk from a not-for-profits perspective, and you give some really good tips and ideas and some of the toolbox and the toolkit and such. What is, overall, do you see the role of government and other authorities in this world?
I think we've seen that really strongly, and it's really depends on your ideology or your thoughts on the role of government. And the idea that government has been a backstop. I mean, I think that has, and largely the federal government over the last 18 months. I mean, a lot of the supports have come through the federal side of things. So they've played that really well. They've offered wage subsidies, the rent stuff, the short-term loan program, perhaps. And so you've seen government play that role. And that's not an inconsequential role. That has kept many organizations going, in fact, and helps organizations do quite well. So that will remain. There will remain a backstop. It may not be quite as widespread. It may not be quite as prevalent in some ways, but you'll see some of that. I think that you'll hopefully have not governments, and to say what role should they play. Governments don't tend to create a lot of jobs. And so in the Alberta situation, the UCP, you'll see the government want to create an environment where jobs and recovery can happen. So they'll play that role of enabler likely. So what's the nonprofit's role in that? Again, can you make the case that you're a job creator in your programs? If you're teaching literacy programs, saying if people are more literate, they're going to become part of the workforce, they fit into your model. So how does your cause fit that? Sometimes you don't want to be disingenuous and make it up, and some don't. But to say, how do I fit this overall recovery model? So I think it really depends on the government in power. Sometimes you'll see some governments, obviously, who have far more governance work, where governments will invest and play a more participatory role in the economy and the social world. Some will step back. I think that's one of the traits of this government, is there's a libertarian side to this, but we don't necessarily need to play a role, and that's probably challenged them, and certainly on the public health side. and they may lean into that more on the recovery side. So not a great answer necessarily, but it's how do you fit into the overall kind of model moving forward, which may shift in 18 months.
Okay. Another question we have from Jen, she's saying, I really agree with the idea of being purpose, mission driven instead of organization focused, Wondering how we support staff, clients, and members with that.
Yeah, that's a good one, right? I mean, I think that's a hard one. And that's where some of that stuff sort of fits in that generative role, which I think is so good for boards, is to be able to play with things, to say, okay, if we're thinking about things that are beyond the comfort level, you don't want to scare staff and say, hey, we're thinking about, winding down the organization so that you can be better served by something else. So there's kind of conversations can be had in different places in different ways. And it's not they need to be hidden, but it's to say you want to be able to, if you're caring for people and providing services, that those folks have the assurance that they will be served. And whether that's for your organization or not, maybe that's important, maybe it's not. But how do you have these conversations in ways that you can parse them out to play with some ideas while at the same time providing those services? So I think that's why boards have this role. That's why I think it's hard for frontline staff. They have the information about today's services. They're the ones you probably can engage in. What does this really look like? But boards have the luxury, and it's that notion of, go back to that quote, they sit both atop and outside the organization. So they don't have the details necessarily of how to run a program, but they have that responsibility overall to say, we need to be here for today and for tomorrow. And they have a bit of an outsider role. And I think you have more license to play with some of those questions, those scenario work. We do some scenario work with organizations where you help people think, okay, what would happen? What you do with? It's not you're trying to guess the future, but you're trying to find out if we've thought through some of these things in advance when it does happen, perhaps, or we can learn from it. So I would be careful, because you don't want to create a situation where you're telegraphing things you're not going to do. One of the problems and one of the obvious things of uncertainty is that the angst that comes with that. So how do you create a sense of stability? How do you, actually have that sense of build a real stable organization? But how do you carve out spaces that are safe to have these conversations about what might happen? Great role for boards and senior staff teams.
Might have time, I think, for one more, maybe two, but there's one from Gerald. You mentioned that the demand for charity services are increasing, but donations aren't following. Can you speak more to what you think are some of the fundamental drivers behind this? Example, unrealistic expectation for standards of living, shifts in values, etc.
Yeah, that's great question. I mean, and there's lots behind it. I think that to understand why donation patterns, I think it's partly it's culturally, and culturally in the sense that as generations have changed, the idea of how much you give back. If you were 50, 60 years ago, in tithing in churches, 10%, not necessarily happened, but you had that notion you gave back a part was maybe not for everybody, but far more culturally based into society. And as we sort of become more independent, it's not about any religion. It's just that we live in different ways. So we have more choices. We have different drivers of giving. I think the numbers of charities probably drive that up. You see lots of comments or lots of thoughts on there's 9,000 charities in this province. Some of those are large sort of government type ones, but even you take those out, you're still looking at 8,500 large, charities. That's a lot of causes, and that's a lot of causes to spread money out between. There's a bit of fatigue. It's hard to know one from the other sometimes. So carving out space, if you're entering into fundraising, how do you carve space for yourself in a pool that's there? I think it's competition. I think one of the things that's happened over probably 30 years or so is the professionalization of fundraising. The discipline of fundraising has gone from kind of a grassroots to a really big machine that we have professional fundraisers. And that's why we're seeing, one of the reasons why we're seeing this concentration. That's why the big players take 80% of the donated dollars, because they have the people, the resources, the messaging to do that. And so I think it's concentration that started taking it there. The stagnation, I'm not sure. I don't really know why. I think it's there. I think there's a lot of reasons. I think there's more choice on consumer side of things. But I'd be speculating as to why. I don't know if anybody knows why that really has happened. I don't know what we can do about it either. I think you make your case, but you're making your case for a smaller pool of funds. And as a sector, that's a tough one, because comes a thing called the tragedy of the commons. When the water pot gets smaller, we all feed from it, no one's satisfied. So I'm not exactly sure what to do with that one.
Okay. Well, I think we're going, that's, the chat box, and there's thoughts, your purpose-driven idea certainly had lots of support there. And then Barb mentioned, when we name our values and philosophies that are linked to our intended outcomes of our service, even more powerful. I think she's mentioning the support for that. Just a comment, I think, that was made there, Mike, as well, just to be aware of supporting that thought that you brought forward. I mean, that's it. Thank you, Mike. On behalf of board leadership of Alberta, I wish we had more time, but on behalf of board leadership and all the participants today, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing with us perspectives on leading in that change and changing environment, not-for-profit environment that we're in right now. You gave us a lot of information, you know, certainly from an economic perspective, that'll be very valuable, you know, for all of us moving forward. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us as part of our Fall Lunch and Learn series. Thank you so much, Mike. There is a link, right, that's going to be in the chat box real soon. I think, is it in there yet? I'll just take a quick little peek. I think Shanna's putting it in there. So we'd like you to get your feedback on your experience today. Click on the link and the evaluation form will come up. And then your information is going to be very, very helpful. So please do that. That would be great. You complete it now, and make sure you click on the link so it comes up, and you can then fill it out a little later today if you don't have the time right now. But once completed, just simply click on the submit button that's at the bottom of the evaluation form, and we'll have obtained your thoughts. And thank you in advance for taking the time to complete the evaluation form. Want to give a shout out to the upcoming Board Leadership Calgary series, the online learning sessions coming up in November. Last November, they initiated the online training board leadership concept. Their sessions were also well attended and received. And on the screen, you can see the dates for their upcoming sessions, their tentative topic areas, and how to register when registration opens up this month very soon. We also have a link to that as well that you'll see very soon in the chat box for the Board Leadership Calgary sessions too. So in closing, on behalf of the Board Leadership Alberta Committee, thank you everyone for taking the time to be with us for this lunch hour in our final Lunch and Learn session. We have the slide decks for today's session is also in the link in the resources. So if you do want to take a peek at this again, the YouTube channel will have the recorded video version. If you want to maybe take a peek at some of the concepts that Mike was brought up forward a little earlier, you can take a look at them again, or even pass it on to others, maybe your board that might be interested in hearing some of the really good messaging, really good information that was well needed, especially the time we're in right now that Mike provided. And as this is the final of the 3 Lunch and Learn sessions today, I really want to say thank you to all of my fellow Board Leadership Alberta Committee members, as well as all the presenter and panelists across the province for all your work in the development and presentation of the Lunch and Learn series. I mean, this was a lot of work goes into those presentations, certainly to have them. I think one of the things we were really up to date, really key information that was very, very helpful, and a lot of work goes into that. So all the presenters, thank you for your time doing that and sharing the latest information from various different sources in different perspectives. But most importantly, a big thank you to all of you out there who have taken the time during your lunch hours to participate in these sessions over the last 3 weeks. So this is a goodbye for, take care, stay healthy, and thank you for everything you do in your communities, and have a great rest of your day, week, and year. All the best.